I hope everyone's doing well wherever you are. And this is something I've been wanting to try for a while, so I'm gonna give it a whirl and see how far it goes. As many know, I'm working on my doctorate now, my PhD in biblical studies, and very often I will talk about some of the things we discuss and some of the more academic oriented research that goes into the Bible and whatnot. And some have asked me, and a number of folks have asked me, some insight into that. So what I've been thinking about is, as I'm doing my research towards the PhD type studies, doing several of these little videos to kind of explain the process and what goes into it, or kind of walk through the research with you all as I do it. And so we'll give it a try. And the passage I'm working on this semester, my research area, is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. And it's a passage that is very often overlooked, I think. And in fact, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians as books are very often overlooked. But this passage is a very, I don't want to say controversial one, but it's a very difficult one, just because of the various areas that it takes you into. It takes you into talk of a man of lawlessness. It takes you into talk of what restrains us, man of lawlessness. It takes us into talk of the end times. And so it takes people into a lot of different directions, and I wanted to cover it a little bit this afternoon. Now, what I'm going to do is break up each of this discussion, this passage, into 3 verses. And so that way it'll be more manageable and a little bit easier to digest as we go on. Now, first, let's understand, when we get into this passage, what is going on here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, where we'll begin, you have to look at this and consider what comes before it. Very often you hear context. Preachers will say, this is in this context, or this is in that context that you have to consider when you're interpreting something, which is very true. But the context isn't just in the passage itself, or in the verses themselves, or what is immediately in front of those verses, the sentence before it or the sentence after. Very often you have to look at the context of that book itself. And in a case like 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you have to look at the context of this in terms of what came before it. And or in the case of 2nd Thessalonians, that 1st Thessalonians came before it, so you have to look towards that direction. And these two epistles, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, are very much preoccupied with one topic. Now, there's other topics, but one topic really stands out, and that is the second coming of Christ. And so in 1 Thessalonians, there was some confusion about the second coming of Christ, and Paul corrects it. And this is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, starting in verse 13, down through chapter 5 through verse 11. And Paul, if you had to put it in a nutshell, he basically tells them, the Lord, you're not going to know when he's coming back. It's going to be like a thief in the night. But you need to be ready when he comes back. And when he comes back, we're going to meet him in the air, and it will be all good for his people. Now, by the time you get to 2 Thessalonians, Paul is having to correct a misunderstanding that has apparently broken out once again here. And really what we need to, when we talk about going back to this idea of context, when we look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, we have to consider the context that he's bringing back up a subject, the second coming, that he's already discussed in 1 Thessalonians. As I said before, chapter 4, verse 13 through 5:11. And even in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 5 to 10, he brings this subject up again. He talks about how the second coming was going to come, and how all the people that had persecuted the Thessalonians are going to be dealt with, and how also those who had not obeyed the gospel will be dealt with in the return of Jesus. And so understand that this is the context this is happening in. Paul didn't all of a sudden shift gears and say, oh yeah, about that second coming thing. This is a strong context through both of these letters, and it's a strong teaching of Paul's. Paul, as we look at our passage here, this is what he says in verse 1. He says, now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers. Now, when he says the coming of Christ, he uses a term here called parousia. Now, this is worth mentioning here because sometimes you'll hear preachers or others use the term parousia, and folks may be a little bit confused what they mean. All you're talking about that is the arrival of Christ, the coming of Christ. And here in the context, it's talking about the second coming of Christ. Now, this is a very common way that Paul uses to describe the coming of Christ. And not only Paul, but other writers as well. Matthew 24, 27, 37, 39, Christ himself referred to his coming. 1 Corinthians 15, 23, Paul uses this term. 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 19, 3:13, 4:15, 5:23, James 5, 7 and 8, 2 Peter 1, 16, and also 3, verse 4, all refer to the coming of Christ. So this is a term very often through the New Testament that describes Jesus' coming. And so that's what Paul uses here. Now, we need to understand that when Paul says this, at the very end of this passage, he's talking about the second coming of Christ, and he says, we ask you, brothers. Now, very often, this is where word studies comes in handy, because very often we can look at something like that and really not give a word like we ask you the proper force that it perhaps should have. Now, the Greek word there, erotao, is very rare in the Pauline corpus, which basically is a fancy scholarly way of saying that Paul doesn't use it very often. And what that tells us is that if Paul doesn't use this word very often in his writings, that when he does use it, perhaps we should pay attention to when he uses it, because maybe there's an underlying reason he's using it here, whereas he doesn't use it very often elsewhere. And in doing so, we find out that Paul uses this particular term for ask in Philippians 4, verse 3, and also 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 1, and also 5, verse 12. And what you'll notice about this is there's two kind of principles you need to understand about Paul using that term for when he wants to say ask. When Paul uses that term, he uses it usually, as you'll see from those passages, with the ideal of familiarity and affection with his audience. Very often when he uses it, he uses the term brothers. So he uses it when he's really addressing people he loves and he cares about and really wants to stress that. Now, the other thing, and I think this is a little bit more relevant for what's going on here, is he uses it in the context of making sure they're staying strong to the apostolic doctrine or staying strong to those who've been placed to teach them or to look over, to be overseers for them, who presumably would be going by the doctrine that they were taught. So when Paul uses this term, he also uses it very strongly in the context of, hey, I'm about to talk to you about something that's very doctrinal, about listening to the folks who know about doctrine. And that's seen, of course, in 1 Thessalonians 4:1 and 5:12. And hopefully you have your Bible in front of you. You can go to those passages on your own. So understand that when Paul, let's bring this all back together, when Paul says now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, like he had talked about previously in 1 Thessalonians, when he says we ask you, brothers, he's not just asking them like, okay, do you want to go to the movies, brothers? Do you want to go play basketball? Do you want to go to dinner? He is asking with this idea. He's really reaching out to them with affection here, and also reaching out to them to really bring their attention to the idea of, okay, I'm really trying to remind or bring you back to something that's very important doctrinally that you need to be holding to here. Now let's move to verse 2. He says, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed either by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Now, this is one of those areas where you start to get very, or it starts to really deepen as far as the confusion, the amount of discussion. And just let me go ahead and head this off. When I talk about, we're looking at this from a scholarly standpoint, we're looking at the tip of the iceberg. I can assure you, we're just kind of gleaming some of these areas. We're not getting very, very deep, but I want to give you kind of a perspective on how this kind of thing works. But do bear in mind, much more discussion goes into this than we will be discussing with this. Now, when he talks about that they not be quickly, so quickly be shaken in mind or alarmed, that Greek word he uses for quickly there's some discussion over this. He uses tekos. And the question is whether he's talking about, he's concerned that they're so quickly fallen into error so quickly after their conversion, or they were instructed. That's one perspective, some say. Some commentators go in that direction, some go in others. The others being that, is he talking about they're so quick to fall into error without really examining the issue, that they were so quickly taken by this without doing their research, without comparing it to what they've been taught? Which way to go on that? Well, it depends on who you ask. For our purposes, and you'll very often hear me say this, particularly in sermons, for our pay grade right now, does it really matter? His point is that he was really concerned that they would be so quickly taken in by this teaching that we're about to talk about here that has settled in, that they didn't go with what they had been taught previously, and of course we'll see that later as well. Now, he says that he was concerned that they'd be shaken in mind, but I want to call our attention instead to where he says that talks about their alarm. Because shaken in mind, I don't have to go into the Greek and all that, what to be shaken in mind means. I think we can pretty much figure it out. They were rattled. It doesn't take a Greek scholar to figure that out. In fact, it would probably take a Greek scholar to make that even more confusing. But that's neither here nor there. But I want to call our attention to where he was concerned that they would be alarmed by this teaching that they would that we're about to talk about. He uses there proeo. And what's significant about this isn't so much the word he uses here to talk about them being alarmed, but the fact that he uses it in the present tense in Greek. And Greek, like any language, it depends on what tense you use something in. That tells you a lot about it. And in this case, the fact that he used it in the present tense gives us a hint that them being alarmed was not just they were alarmed once. They were disturbed once. This is just a one and done kind of thing. By it being in the present tense, you're getting this idea of a continual state of mental disturbance, a continual state of being alarmed. This was something they were dwelling on. This is something that was constantly alarming them. This wasn't they got upset one time and they were good. This wasn't they got upset that morning and then went out, okay, it's cool, have a picnic. The world's great. This is something that was continually alarming them and bothering them that he's referring to here. And so we need to keep that in the back of our mind. Now, what was it that was alarming them? He was concerned that they, be it by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us, that they would get the idea that the day of the Lord had already come. Now, something that will stand out with this is first the teaching he's referring to here. The teaching he's concerned about that had infected the Thessalonians was one that the day of the Lord had already come. Somebody was teaching them, or somehow they had gotten the impression that the day of the Lord had come. Jesus had already returned or about to return or something along those lines. There's some discussion on that. But they had gotten this idea that the day of the Lord had already arrived. Now, notice Paul gives several different ways they could have gotten this impression. They could have got it, he said, by a spirit, which would have been some kind of a spiritual utterance. Someone saying, the Spirit tells me to say this, or something of that sort. They could have gotten it by a spoken word. A preacher could have came and taught this in error. Or perhaps they had gotten it from a letter that they thought may have been from Paul and his associates here. And this goes into an incredibly deep discussion I won't even touch upon here. But the idea Paul's saying is that by whatever means they've gotten this idea, he did not want them to be in error by this idea that they have received here. He wants to clarify this for them. Now, when he says it could have been a letter that came from him and his co-workers, some have suggested that perhaps they had read 1 Thessalonians. And remember I said before, 1 Thessalonians talks about this subject, and maybe they had gotten that completely wrong. Perhaps someone had distorted 1 Thessalonians, because that doesn't happen, does it? Preachers don't come along and get the Bible wrong and then teach it to people in error, and then people end up in error. So we really don't know how they got this idea, from what source it came. Or perhaps Paul had legitimately taught or written 1 Thessalonians 4, and someone had come in there and kind of gave their own commentary as they read 1 Thessalonians publicly, and perhaps caused some confusion there. What I want to stress through all this is so many ways this could have happened. So many ways they could have gotten into error over this. And Paul's covering all his bases. He's saying, however it happened, I don't want you to be alarmed by this false teaching, this idea that the day of the Lord has already arrived. I do not want you alarmed by that, however it happened. Now, how could that teaching have come about? Now, there is a lot of discussion on that among scholars. And the reason there's a lot of discussion among that, and you'll see this is a trend when it comes to a lot of scholars have a bunch of different opinions on something. Even though scholars by their nature have different opinions, if you find two scholars that agree on everything, you found a unicorn. That's the likelihood. Scholars differ all over the board. But when I'm talking about on a particular subject, where you have scholars differ with so many different explanations, usually there's a reason why. It's because it's an area that the Bible quite often does not give us enough information, that we don't know the full story. It's like listening to a one-sided telephone conversation. And someone, say you're in the room and someone's having a telephone conversation with someone and they mention, a particular comment without many details, but you know just enough. You can infer they might be talking about this or this or this based on the knowledge you have, but you can't really know for certain. That's kind of the issue that's happening here. Why was people saying that the day of the Lord had already come? As I said before, perhaps it was some kind of confusion. Or some have suggested it was what they call in scholarship an overly realized eschatology. This idea that the day of the Lord had already come, or it could be a teaching similar to what we find in 2 Timothy 2, verses 17 to 18, where someone had taught, in a very similar manner. We don't know. But I give you, that particular passage just so you understand it. It could be one of those kind of things going on, but we don't know. Now, here's where I want us to tap the brakes for a minute and ask, when we get to biblical scholarship questions like this, and I say this very often in lessons and in Bible studies, there's areas of the Bible we get to where we don't know the full answer. And that's okay. It's okay to say we don't know the full answer. There is nothing wrong with saying, I don't know. That's one of the areas where I greatly respect atheists. They're willing to say on a question, I don't know. And there are areas in the Bible where we can get to where we don't know exactly what brought this teaching about. We don't know where this came from. So what do we do at that point? As I said before, that's where you go with what you do know. You don't speak beyond it. You don't make assumptions. You speak with what you do know. And if there's areas where you may suspect this might be at work, that's where you say, this is my opinion. This is a theory some have suggested. This is a suggestion some have made, but you keep it to what you can say. You honestly know that you can go to book, chapter, verse and say why you know this is true. And that's what we do with this situation. What do we know from this? We know that the Thessalonians were alarmed. We know Paul had already written to them about this question. We're going to get to that a lot more later, of course. And we know that Paul is trying to get their attention by asking them and saying, please listen to me. This is important. Just by his choice of Greek words there. We can infer that could potentially be at work, I should say. But also we know that however they got this idea that the day of the Lord had already come, Paul wasn't quite sure how they had precisely got that idea. And where that teaching had come from, we cannot be precisely sure. But what we can be precisely sure about is, notice Paul's reaction here. I want to correct this. However it got there, however you got confused with this, I want to correct this situation. Now let's move to verse 3 and wrap this up in our here. Paul says, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day, talking about the day of the Lord, will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. So something has to happen first before the day of the Lord will arrive. And this is where in this passage it starts to get where much discussion comes. This is where you start getting where scholars who may have agreed in the first couple verses somewhat, they start really divvying up after this. They start taking different positions after this, because this is where verses 3 through 12 there really gets to some of the meat of some of the highly debated meaning of these passages, their precise meaning, I should say. And I will reiterate what I said before. Do understand this. This isn't people that just haven't looked at the Bible enough. That's sometimes what people say when someone does a Bible study and they have confusion on something, or they have different questions or different answers or different explanations. This isn't a question of whether they've studied the Bible. This isn't a question of whether they've looked at it from an angle we somehow think they've missed. The folks that have, the biblical scholars that have looked at this from every angle, from every perspective, probably that has ever been printed very often. And there is still great debate on many of the verses that are going to come after this. But let's look at what we can talk about here in verse 3 as we wrap this up. When he talks about something has to happen first, a rebellion has to happen first, and the revelation of this son of lawlessness, this man of lawlessness, this son of destruction. When he says a rebellion has to happen first, let's go back to our Greek here. He says apostia. Now, if you're familiar with religion, and particularly with Christianity, when you hear apostia, when you hear that, that sounds a lot like what word? Apostasy, doesn't it? There's a reason why. It's that you can probably figure out why. And the thing about it is, when this word is used, when you're doing a word study, and hopefully everyone's had some experience with word studies in your own private study, and if not, that's something that you'll develop over time. When you do a word study on this, and I'm talking about the Greek word, not every place you see rebellion mentioned in the New Testament. When you really want to do a word study, you want to go back to what the Greek word said and where the Greek word is used. And when you look at where this Greek word is used in the New Testament, you're not going to find many locations. In fact, the place it is used in the New Testament, it's used in Acts, And if we were to turn to Acts 21:21, what we'll find is that it goes back to the ministry of Paul, and where there's some concern over his teaching, and it's being remarked, I should say, that people have been told that Paul taught all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. And so what you see is going on here, and that's where this same Greek word for the rebellion is used. In the New Testament, we get this implication of some kind of a religious kind of rebellion, a turning away from the truth kind of thing going on. And that's also what we see in the Greek Old Testament. Now, what we have is what we find in our English version of the Bible that you probably have on, hopefully very nearby right now, but in general that you read, that you go to church with, whether it be, the King James, New King James, New American Standard, or my personal favorite, ESV, or actually my favorite's the Greek and the Hebrew Bible, but whatever version of the English Bible you have, what you probably have for the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures is what was from the Hebrew and what was called the Masoretic text. Well, prior, maybe in the century or so prior to the Lord Jesus' day, or prior to the New Testament writing, there was a translation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, into Greek, which was called the Septuagint. And that was because of the number of scholars that had worked on it and had translated it back in that day. And so very often when we see a Greek word that's not used in the New Testament very much, we can go back to the Greek Old Testament and get an idea of what kind of a meaning it gives us. And whereas Acts 21:21 kind of gives this idea of the Greek word that's used for rebellion here in 2 Thessalonians 2, 3, that this idea of rebellion, Acts 21:21 uses it in the idea of this kind of religious rebellion. You get that same idea in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, in Joshua 22:22 and 2 Chronicles 29:19 of this religious kind of rebellion. So even though this word very often in the secular or the pagan literature or the non-biblical literature is used to talk about some kind of an uprising or some kind of rebellion that might be a political rebellion or something like that, when we see it in the scripture, whether it be the New Testament or whether it be in the Greek Old Testament, very often this, or not just very often, primarily it seems this word is used with the idea of a religious kind of rebellion, a spiritual rebellion against God. So that's probably what 2 Thessalonians is talking about here. When he says that a rebellion needs to come first before the day of the Lord, he's probably talking about some kind of religious type of rebellion. He's talking about some ultimate rebellion against God. And this would have been very common in the early Christian teaching. This was something that the idea of a religious apostasy in the last days, a religious rebellion by people against God, was very common. You can see that in writings outside of the Bible. In a lot of the Jewish writings. Now, someone will say, why are we looking to those? And I'm talking about writings like 2nd Esdras, 1st Enoch, Jubilees, things like that, all talked about this rebellion that will come, this spiritual rebellion in the last days. And somebody may ask, well, why are you going to these books that aren't in the Bible? They all say they're not inspired. Well, okay, no. But what they do tell us is what the people within a century or so before and after the Bible, or during the time of the New Testament was written, or slightly before the New Testament was written, and in the time after the Old Testament was written, they tell us what was on the people of that day's mind. So it can be argued, rightly, that some of these views would have been in the perspective of many of the earliest Christians here. And also we see it in the Christian tradition. And when I say tradition, I'm talking about it in terms of the teachings that go back to early Christianity here, from the New Testament here, as opposed to later things that may have been developed. We see it in Matthew 24, verses 10 and 11, and also verse 24. And that was a passage talking about the end times, where it is explicitly stated that people will be led away, that there will be, people kind of taken in by false Christs and false messiahs, and that people will fall away, I should say, more specifically in this case. But also 1 Timothy 4, verses 1-3, outright talks about the kind of rebellion that will come, and because people are led by deceitful spirits and whatnot in the later days. And you can even see further on, both before this passage and also after it in 2 Thessalonians, whether it be chapter 1, verse 4-5, or chapter 2, verse 10-12, where rebellion against God's will was going to be a very big part of this. So when he talks about a rebellion needs to come first, he is referring to not a political rebellion that's got to come first before the Lord comes back, but he's talking about a spiritual rebellion against God, where people will reject God's word, where people will turn against God's word. And hopefully now you're starting to see a difficulty in that, because throughout time, people can always point to this time or that time when this has happened or when this is going to happen. But therein lies the big difficulty of this passage. A time, when he talks about a time where rebellion is going to come, can you really put a finger on any time in history where that hasn't happened since the New Testament times? You can even look back to Israel's history of all the times of rebellion against God. So it's really hard to kind of pick out what time of rebellion he's talking about here. But we need to at least get the principle he's referring to here. It goes back to what I said before. If you can't really narrow it down for certainty, go with what you do know. What we do know is he's talking about a time that before the Lord comes, there is going to be a rebellion, people turning away from God. Now, whether that time has already come, whether it is to come, it's kind of in my opinion, I'm going to kind of heed my own advice here. In my opinion, it's kind of immaterial. The principle here is we must always be on guard against this rebellion that will go against God. Now, let's look at the way he describes this man of lawlessness. Or what must come after. A rebellion, but also the arrival of a man of lawlessness. Now, this is where there's a lot of, there's some difficulty. Because here's another area, might as well get our feet wet on as we look at this. If you hold up two different English translations on a particular passage, sometimes they might word it differently. Sometimes they might omit a word. Sometimes they might use a different word. And sometimes preachers, with all due respect to preachers who might fall into this trap, kind of forget or may not be aware of what preachers should be to my knowledge, are trained at one of their first days or the first semester or two in preaching training. The idea of what's called textual criticism. The idea that we have the manuscripts that were translated from the biblical or from the New Testament times. We have the manuscripts that have come down that were translated so that we have our English translations of the Bible. Well, the thing is, of these manuscripts, we have thousands of them. I think last count was over 6,000 at varying dates. Some of them came from relatively a good while after, centuries, a lot of centuries after the New Testament times. Some came within a few centuries of the New Testament times. And it's not that we're discovering them all at once. We're constantly have been discovering these things. So when some of your translations like the King James and whatnot were written, they only had a certain amount of manuscripts on hand. Well, since then, other manuscripts that date to before the ones used in the King James have been found. And so many of your modern English translations, rightly, and notice I said this, rightly, they're doing the right thing here, despite what preachers will say, they're doing the right thing. Some preachers will say. They're taking into account these manuscripts we have that date to earlier than the ones that the King James and other translations were based on. So they're trying to make sure we have the earliest manuscripts, accounted for. And so sometimes what'll happen is you'll have one manuscript that's from a later date say one thing, and one from an earlier date that says or omits something else. And so there's this big discussion on what's called textual criticism, where very, very brilliant, very scholarly people go through and literally try to figure out which reading, which text in this case has the one that is more likely to have been written originally. And so sometimes you'll have where different words are used. Well, that's what happens here in this passage. When some translations you might see, instead of the man of lawlessness, might say the man of sin. And the reason for that is there's translations that say, manuscripts that were translated to make our English Bible that say use anomia, lawlessness there in that passage. But other manuscripts that we have uses hamartia, sin. So some translations have the word for lawlessness there, some have the word for sin there. And so what these textual critics have to figure out before you can get to interpreting this passage, they got to figure out exactly which one is the word that was used here. Now, where this gets difficult is the one for the word anomia for lawlessness is a very rare word by Paul. He does use it, but he doesn't use it often. But hamartia, Paul uses all the time, obviously. So you have to decide, did Paul use the word for lawlessness early on, a word he rarely uses, and then somebody later substituted it with a word that he uses a lot, accident or maybe by habit, and it just got translated or copied and copied and copied? Or was it a case of Paul using hamartia, a word he uses a lot, And then later somebody inadvertently translated and used another word. This is where scholars have to make an educated guess. And I want to stress that, an educated guess. They're not flipping a coin, even though that would make it way easier, trust me. They have to make an educated guess. And probably the best way to go with this is that originally the text said a man of lawlessness, not a man of sin. Why? Because elsewhere in this passage, verse 7, he uses the term lawlessness. And this would be a great place to introduce it. So probably he's calling this man a man of lawlessness. Now, this goes back to a trend I've been saying all throughout this, though. Someone might say, well, it could easily go the other way, too. Okay, either way, man of lawlessness, man of sin, the same principle is there. For our pay grade, for our Christian living pay grade, the same principle is there, isn't it? This man is going to be a man who's going to just epitomize a rejection of God. He's going to epitomize just doing his way instead of God's way. Epitomize a man who rebels against God. And the way we know that is because, going back to the Greek here, he uses the genitive in Greek here, which probably represents a relationship or a quality. So that's the fancy way of saying that this man of lawlessness will be someone who represents the fullest expression of lawlessness or sin. This guy is just going to be everything about that's going to come around. I like what one of the scholars, Wanamaker, has said. And I think he expressed it so perfectly. He's one characterized by a blatant disregard and opposition to the will of God. That's the man that has to arrive first before the day of the Lord will come. Now notice how else he describes this man. He calls him a son of destruction. Now why does he use this phrase? Now he could be drawing upon the Greek Old Testament version of Isaiah 57, 3 and 4. And unless you have the Greek Old Testament in front of you, that won't make much sense there, and especially in its original Greek. But the idea that he said when he says the son of destruction, whether he made that term up or whether he used Isaiah 57, 3 and 4, the Greek version, to kind of word it there, the idea Paul was saying here when he says that idea of the son of destruction, he's saying this guy is associated with destruction in the sense of this is the fate that awaits him. He's a man who's going to come along and he's going to be all about a rebellion against God, but destruction is ultimately what's going to come his way, as we're going to see later on. And this is a good place to wrap things up because I've given you a lot and I've kind of has little interludes in it. But I want you to kind of, in these first 3 verses, to get what was coming down. This is kind of the preacher summary. I've given you a taste, a little bit of the scholar stuff, but this is kind of the preacher summary at the end. This is what you can take and help yourself in your Christian life. The Thessalonians who had been taught in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 on into verse 5 had confusion about the day of the Lord's coming. Paul had reassured them, and now he's having to write another letter to them. And he's already told them there in the first chapter of 2 Thessalonians 2, the day when the Lord comes back, all those who've been oppressing you and all those who've not obeyed the gospel will be dealt with by God. But then he changes gears and he says, I'm asking you, brothers, don't get rattled. Don't get stirred up and don't get just so mentally disturbed, constantly dwelling on this error that somehow you've learned about, that the day of the Lord had already come. He said, I don't care where it came from, but I want to correct you on this, that something has to happen first. Don't be deceived. Don't let them fool you. First, this great rebellion against God has got to happen. A religious, spiritual rebellion. First, the man of lawlessness, or the man of sin, has to arrive, however you want to go with that. This one who epitomizes, who is the very definition, if you wanted to show a person that just was everything you thought about someone rebelling against God, that would be this person that has arrived. But it's a person who ultimately their fate is to be destroyed. So he's already setting it up how they were disturbed, already saying some things that's going to get him a little bit nervous when he talks about a rebellion, but he's already also given him a promise, a hint that the day's coming when this will be defeated right before the Lord returns. I've talked way too much, but hopefully that'll give you something to kind of, get a perspective on the geek stuff. And of course, I'll continue with the right on through this passage. But I hope everyone's staying safe, and I hope everyone's, you and your family are staying safe. And I'll hopefully see everyone or talk to everyone later on.